"Boss, this boy lived with me in the orphanage!" The scream echoed through the mansion's marble halls. Isabella stood frozen, pointing at the portrait with trembling hands. Her wealthy employer turned pale. What she said next would shatter everything. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the opulent living room of the Worthington mansion, its thousands of tiny prisms refracting light into rainbow patterns that seemed almost mocking in their beauty. Isabella Martinez moved silently across the imported marble floors, her cleaning supplies cart making the softest whisper of sound as its wheels glided over surfaces that cost more than she'd earn in 5 years. She'd learned to be invisible here, to blend into the background like the expensive furniture, to exist without existing. At 28 years old, Isabella had perfected the art of disappearing. Her hands, rough from years of manual labor, moved with practiced efficiency as she dusted the endless collection of artifacts and art pieces that decorated the Worthington home. Each item had a story, she imagined. Trips to distant countries, exclusive auctions, connections with famous artists. Each item also represented a life she would never live, a world she could only observe from behind the transparent barrier of service. The mansion itself was a monument to excess. 15 bedrooms, each larger than the entire apartment Isabella shared with her aging mother in the city's forgotten neighborhoods. 10 bathrooms with fixtures that sparkled like jewelry. A kitchen that could serve a restaurant. Gardens that required a team of 6 gardeners to maintain. And everywhere, the oppressive weight of wealth that reminded her constantly of the vast gulf between her life and theirs. "Isabella," the sharp voice of Margaret Worthington, the lady of the house, cut through the silence like a knife. "Those windows won't clean themselves, and make sure you use the special cloth for the frames. They're imported from Europe and cost more than your monthly salary." "Yes, ma'am," Isabella responded automatically, her voice trained to be soft, deferential, apologetic for existing. Margaret Worthington was a woman who wore her wealth like armor. Everything about her screamed money, from her perfectly styled hair that required weekly salon visits, to her designer clothes that she wore once before discarding, to the way she moved through her home as if she were royalty gracing peasants with her presence. She'd never worked a day in her life, having married into the Worthington fortune, and she treated the staff with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had to consider another person's humanity. "And Isabella," Margaret added, her voice dripping with condescension, "try not to touch anything valuable directly. Your hands leave marks on everything. Use gloves, for heaven's sake." Isabella nodded, swallowing the familiar taste of humiliation. She'd worked for the Worthingtons for 6 months now, and each day brought new reminders of her place in their world. She was furniture that breathed, a tool that performed tasks, a ghost that cleaned up after the living. As Margaret click-clacked away on heels that cost more than Isabella's car, Isabella turned her attention to the massive wall above the fireplace. It was covered with portraits, the Worthington family gallery, a visual history of wealth and privilege spanning generations. She'd cleaned these portraits dozens of times, each face a stranger staring down at her with varying degrees of aristocratic aloofness. But today, as she climbed the stepladder to reach the upper frames, something caught her eye. A new portrait had been hung since her last cleaning. It was positioned in the center of the gallery, clearly a place of honor, and it depicted a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, dressed formally with an expression of careful composure. Isabella's hand froze mid-wipe. Her cleaning cloth dropped from her fingers, falling to the marble floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the enormous room. The blood drained from her face as she stared at the portrait, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. After all these years, in this house of all places to find. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "It can't be." The boy in the portrait had eyes that she'd recognize anywhere. Eyes that had stared back at her across cold orphanage bedrooms, eyes that had cried silent tears in the night, eyes that had eventually stopped showing any emotion at all. The shape of his face, the set of his mouth, the way his small hands were clasped formally in front of him, every detail was seared into her memory from a lifetime ago. "Thomas," she breathed, the name falling from her lips like a prayer, like a ghost story, like a wound that had never healed. Her legs suddenly felt weak. She gripped the stepladder for support, her knuckles turning white as waves of memory crashed over her with crushing force. The orphanage, the cold, the hunger, the other children. And Thomas, quiet, withdrawn Thomas, who'd arrived one winter and disappeared the next, leaving behind only questions and a void that no one bothered to fill. "Isabella, what on earth are you doing just standing there?" Margaret's voice snapped her back to the present. "If you're finished with the windows, there are bathrooms that need attention. Time is money, and you're wasting mine." But Isabella couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the portrait, couldn't process the impossible reality that the boy she'd known in the depths of poverty and abandonment was somehow connected to this palace of privilege. "Did you hear me?" Margaret's voice was closer now, irritation giving way to anger. "Isabella, I'm speaking to you!" Something inside Isabella snapped. Perhaps it was the years of humiliation. Perhaps it was the shock of recognition. Perhaps it was the sudden, overwhelming need to know the truth about a boy who'd haunted her dreams for 15 years. Whatever it was, it shattered the careful control she'd maintained for 6 months. "Boss," Isabella said, her voice stronger than it had ever been in this house. She turned from the portrait to face Margaret, who had entered the room with her usual expression of perpetual dissatisfaction. "Boss, this boy lived with me in the orphanage." The words exploded from her mouth, propelled by emotion too powerful to contain. She pointed at the portrait with a trembling hand, her entire body shaking with the force of revelation. "What?" Margaret's face registered confusion, then annoyance. "What are you talking about? Have you lost your mind?" "That boy!" Isabella's voice rose, months of silent servitude evaporating in an instant. "In that portrait, his name is Thomas. Thomas Patterson. He lived with me at St. Catherine's Orphanage 15 years ago. I know him. I know that face. I'd recognize him anywhere." Margaret's expression transformed from annoyance to something that looked almost like fear. Her perfectly made-up face went pale beneath her expensive cosmetics. She took a step backward, her hand reaching for the nearby sofa as if she needed support. You're mistaken," Margaret stammered, but there was something in her voice now, something uncertain. "That's a portrait of that is, you're clearly confused." "I'm not confused." Isabella descended the stepladder, her fear of consequences evaporating in the face of this impossible truth. "I lived with him for months. We shared meals, we shared sleeping quarters, we shared everything that orphans share when they have nothing. That's Thomas. What is his portrait doing in your house?" The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. From somewhere in the depths of the mansion, footsteps approached. Heavy, measured, male footsteps. Jonathan Worthington entered the room with the commanding presence of a man accustomed to controlling every situation. At 55, he was the patriarch of the Worthington fortune, a business mogul whose name appeared regularly in financial publications and whose opinions moved markets. Tall, imposing, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that only generational wealth can provide, he surveyed the scene before him with calculating eyes. "What's going on here?" His voice was deep, authoritative, the voice of a man who expected immediate answers and complete obedience. "Margaret, why is the staff shouting?" "Jonathan, this woman—" Margaret couldn't seem to form complete sentences. She gestured helplessly toward Isabella, toward the portrait, her usual composure completely shattered. Isabella found herself facing the full force of Jonathan Worthington's attention. Any other day, she would have withered under that gaze, would have apologized profusely and retreated to her designated invisibility. But not today. Not with Thomas's face staring down at her from the wall, demanding answers that had been buried for 15 years. "Mr. Worthington," Isabella said, her voice steadier than she felt. "That portrait, the boy, his name is Thomas Patterson. He lived with me at St. Catherine's Orphanage 15 years ago. I need to know why his portrait is hanging in your home." Jonathan's face went through a series of expressions so quickly that Isabella almost missed them. Shock, recognition, calculation, and finally, a cold mask of control. He looked at the portrait, then at Isabella, then back at the portrait. "You're mistaken," he said firmly. But there was something beneath his authoritative tone, something that sounded almost like panic. "That portrait is of a distant relative. You're clearly confused." "I'm not confused." Isabella's voice broke with emotion. I know that face. I know those eyes. Thomas arrived at the orphanage when he was 7. He barely spoke. He had nightmares every night. He used to hide food under his mattress because he was afraid there wouldn't be breakfast. I held his hand during thunderstorms because they terrified him. That's Thomas! The specificity of her memories hung in the air like accusations. Jonathan and Margaret exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. A glance that confirmed Isabella's words were hitting a target they desperately wanted to keep hidden. Thomas Patterson disappeared from the orphanage one day. Isabella continued, tears streaming down her face now. No explanation, no goodbye. One morning he was there and the next he was gone. The staff said he'd been adopted, but they wouldn't give us any details. We never knew what happened to him. And now I find his portrait here, in this mansion, hanging like he's part of your family. That's enough! Jonathan's voice cracked like a whip. You're clearly delusional. Margaret, call the agency. This woman is no longer employed here. I want her out of my house immediately. But Isabella stood her ground, something she'd never done before in her life. I'm not leaving until someone tells me the truth. What happened to Thomas? Why is his portrait in your house? Where is he now? Security! Jonathan shouted toward the intercom system. I need security in the main living room now. Please, Isabella begged, all her earlier strength dissolving into desperate pleading. Just tell me what happened to him. Is he alive? Is he okay? He was just a little boy who'd already suffered so much. Please, I need to know he's all right. Margaret, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and it was directed at Jonathan, not Isabella. She knows his name. She knows details. Jonathan, she actually knows. Shut up, Jonathan hissed at his wife, but it was too late. The admission hung in the air, confirming everything Isabella had suspected. 2 security guards entered the room, large men in professional uniforms who looked at Isabella with the practiced indifference of people hired to remove problems. Escort this woman out, Jonathan ordered. She's terminated. Have her final paycheck sent to her address, and make sure she signs a non-disclosure agreement before she leaves the property. No! Isabella struggled as the guards took her arms, but gently, not roughly. They weren't cruel, just efficient. Please, just tell me about Thomas. Where is he? What happened to him? As they guided her toward the door, Isabella twisted to look back at the portrait one last time. Thomas's face stared down at her from the wall, frozen in childhood, trapped in expensive paint and canvas. And Isabella realized with sickening certainty that there was a story here, a story that the Worthingtons were desperate to keep hidden. I'll find out the truth, she shouted, as the guards led her through the mansion's grand entrance. Thomas deserves that much. You can throw me out, but you can't stop me from finding out what happened to him. The massive front doors closed behind her with a definitive boom, cutting off her last view of the portrait, leaving her standing on the steps of the mansion she'd just been expelled from, her mind reeling with questions that demanded answers. Behind those closed doors, Jonathan and Margaret Worthington stood in their living room, staring at each other with expressions of barely contained panic. She knows, Margaret whispered. Jonathan, she actually knows him. This isn't just some random claim. She knows details that only someone who actually lived with him could know. Jonathan's face was pale beneath his tan. We need to contain this, now. Before she starts digging. Before she finds out what we did, Margaret finished, her voice hollow. They both looked up at the portrait of the young boy, at the face that stared down at them with innocent eyes, unaware of the secrets and lies that surrounded him, unaware of the truth that was about to be unearthed after 15 years of careful burial. And in that moment, they both knew that the past they'd worked so hard to hide was about to come crashing down around them. Because Isabella Martinez, the quiet maid they'd dismissed as forgettable and powerless, had just become the most dangerous person in their world. The bus ride from the affluent hills where the Worthington mansion stood to the forgotten neighborhoods of the city's eastern district took 45 minutes. But for Isabella, it felt like traveling through different worlds. She pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching as manicured lawns and pristine streets gradually gave way to cracked sidewalks and buildings that wore their age like battle scars. Her hands still trembled. The shock of recognition, the confrontation, the expulsion. It had all happened so fast that her mind was still catching up with reality. She'd lost her job. 6 months of employment. gone in an instant. The paycheck she'd been counting on to cover her mother's medication vanished. The careful budget she'd constructed demolished. But none of that mattered compared to the burning question consuming her thoughts. What had happened to Thomas? The memory of his face, both the young boy she'd known and the portrait frozen in time, haunted her. Thomas Patterson had been 7 years old when he arrived at St. Catherine's Orphanage, a ghost of a child who barely spoke and flinched at sudden movements. Isabella had been 13 then, old enough to feel protective of the younger children, old enough to recognize trauma when she saw it. She'd taken Thomas under her wing in the way older orphanage children often did, forming the makeshift families that institutions could never provide. She'd saved portions of her meals for him when he was too afraid to eat in the cafeteria. She'd told him stories to help him sleep when nightmares kept him awake. She'd taught him to trust, slowly, painfully, one small moment at a time. And then one morning, he was simply gone. The bus jerked to a stop at her destination, pulling Isabella from her memories. She stepped onto familiar streets that held 15 years of her history, the neighborhood where she'd grown up after aging out of the orphanage system, where she'd struggled to build a life from nothing, where every corner held reminders of poverty's grinding persistence. Her apartment was a modest space on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator hadn't worked in years, so Isabella climbed the stairs, her legs heavy with exhaustion and emotional overload. Inside, her mother Rosa was sitting by the window, as she always did, watching the street below with the patient observation of someone with nowhere else to be. "Mija, you're home early," Rosa said, turning her weathered face toward her daughter. At 62, she looked older, worn down by years of manual labor and the progressive illness that had forced her retirement. Did something happen? Isabella collapsed onto the worn sofa, and the entire story poured out. The portrait, the recognition, the confrontation, the expulsion. Rosa listened with the quiet attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating injustice and knew its patterns well. "Thomas," Rosa repeated when Isabella finished. "The quiet boy you used to talk about, the one who disappeared." "Mama, I need to find out what happened to him," Isabella said, desperation making her voice crack. "The Worthingtons know something. They're hiding something. The way they reacted when I said his name. There's a secret there, and it has something to do with Thomas." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working the rosary beads she always kept nearby. "Mija, people like the Worthingtons, they have power. They have lawyers and money and connections. If they're hiding something, they have the resources to keep it hidden." "I don't care," Isabella said fiercely. "Thomas was just a child. Whatever they did, whatever they're hiding, he deserves someone to care enough to find out the truth." "Then where will you start?" Isabella thought for a moment. "St. Catherine's. I need to go back to the orphanage. There must be records, files, something that explains what happened to him." The next morning, Isabella found herself standing before the red brick building that had been her home for 5 formative years. St. Catherine's Orphanage looked smaller than she remembered, more worn, as if the weight of housing broken childhoods had taken a physical toll on its structure. The same chain-link fence surrounded the property, though it sagged in places now. The same playground equipment sat rusting in the yard, a graveyard of childhood joys that poverty had killed. The front office smelled of old paper and institutional cleaning products, scents that transported Isabella instantly back to adolescence. The woman behind the desk was new, a tired-looking administrator with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up from her computer. "My name is Isabella Martinez. I lived here about 15 years ago. I'm trying to find information about another child who was here at the same time, Thomas Patterson. He would have been here for several months before being adopted." The woman finally looked up, her expression already forming the negative response that Isabella had expected. "I'm sorry, but we can't release information about former residents. Privacy laws, you understand. I'm not asking for his current address or anything that would violate his privacy," Isabella pressed. "I just need to know what happened to him. Who adopted him? Why was his adoption kept so secret? The other children weren't even allowed to say goodbye." "Miss Martinez, I understand you're concerned about a childhood friend, but those records are sealed. Even if I wanted to help you, which I don't have authorization to do, many of our older files were digitized and the hard copies destroyed. Without proper legal documentation requesting the information, there's nothing I can do. Isabella felt frustration building in her chest. Can I at least speak to someone who worked here 15 years ago? Maybe they remember Thomas, remember something about his adoption? The woman sighed, clearly wanting this conversation to end. Sister Margaret is the only staff member still here from that time. She's in the chapel, but I warn you, she's elderly, and her memory isn't what it used to be. The orphanage chapel was a small, dim space that smelled of candle wax and old wood. Sister Margaret knelt in prayer near the altar, her back curved with age, her habit pristine despite its obvious years. When Isabella's footsteps echoed on the stone floor, the elderly nun turned slowly. "Can I help you, child?" "Sister Margaret, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Isabella Martinez. I lived here about 15 years ago." Recognition flickered across the old woman's face. "Isabella, yes, I remember. You were always helping with the younger children. You had a good heart. Sister, I need to ask you about Thomas Patterson. Do you remember him?" The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Sister Margaret's face went pale, and she gripped the pew in front of her for support. "Thomas," she whispered. "After all these years, someone finally asks about Thomas." Isabella's heart began to race. "You do remember him? Sister, please. I need to know what happened to him. I saw his portrait hanging in a mansion on the west side, the Worthington Mansion." "Why would they have his portrait?" Sister Margaret gestured for Isabella to sit beside her. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with years of carrying a burden. "That child, that poor, poor child. I've prayed for him every day since he left here. What happened to him?" The nun was quiet for so long that Isabella thought she might not answer. Then, slowly, painfully, the story began to emerge. "Thomas wasn't his original name," Sister Margaret began. "When he arrived here, he was registered under a different name, but the staff was instructed to call him Thomas. He came to us under unusual circumstances. Most children arrive through social services, through proper channels. Thomas arrived in the middle of the night, brought by a lawyer, with paperwork that sealed his previous identity." "A lawyer?" Isabella's mind raced. "What lawyer?" "A man named Richard Blackwood. He's a prominent attorney who handles sensitive matters for wealthy families. He brought Thomas, handed us a substantial donation, and gave explicit instructions that the boy's presence here was to be kept confidential. We weren't to discuss him with anyone, weren't to process his paperwork through normal channels." "Why? Why all the secrecy?" Sister Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know all the details. I wasn't privy to the full story. But I gathered from conversations I overheard that Thomas had been involved in some kind of family situation. There was talk of scandal, of protecting reputations, of making problems disappear. And then, he disappeared from the orphanage," Isabella prompted. "He was here for several months, long enough for us to see that he was a deeply traumatized child, long enough for us to hope that maybe, with time and care, he might heal. Then one day, the same lawyer returned. He had papers, all legal and proper. He said Thomas was being adopted by a family who could provide for him, who would give him opportunities he'd never have otherwise." "The Worthingtons," Isabella breathed. Sister Margaret nodded slowly. "I was never given their name officially, but yes, I believe it was them. The lawyer made it very clear that this adoption was to remain confidential. Thomas left in the middle of the night just as he'd arrived. The other children woke up and he was simply gone. We were instructed to tell anyone who asked that he'd been adopted and to provide no further information. But why? Why all this secrecy? If they adopted him legally, why hide it?" "That's what I've wondered for 15 years, Sister Margaret said, her voice breaking. "What kind of adoption requires such secrecy? What kind of family takes a child and then hides his very existence? I've asked myself 1,000 times if I should have done something, said something, reported something. But what? Everything was technically legal. The paperwork was in order. And I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of men like Richard Blackwood and families like the Worthingtons. They have the kind of power that can destroy anyone who gets in their way. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I chose silence. I chose to keep my position here, to continue helping the children I could help, rather than risk everything by questioning what happened to one boy." Isabella felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Sister, that portrait I saw, It was Thomas at about 7 or 8 years old. If the Worthingtons adopted him, if he's been living with them all these years, why have I never seen or heard of him? Why is he only present in a portrait? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. "There's something else," Sister Margaret said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone. About a year after Thomas left, I received a letter. No return address, postmarked from a city hours away from here. Inside was a single sentence written in a child's handwriting. 'Please help me, Sister Margaret.'" Isabella gasped. "Thomas? I don't know. The letter was unsigned. But the handwriting. I'd seen Thomas practice his letters during his time here. It could have been him. I took the letter to the director at the time, and she immediately contacted Richard Blackwood. He came to the orphanage, took the letter, and assured us it was nothing, probably a prank or a mistake. He said Thomas was thriving in his new home, that we had nothing to worry about." "But you didn't believe him?" "No," Sister Margaret whispered. "I didn't believe him. But what could I do? I was a nun in an orphanage. He was a powerful attorney, representing one of the city's most influential families. Who would believe me? Who would even listen?" Isabella stood up, her mind racing with this new information. "Sister, I need the name and address of that lawyer. Richard Blackwood. Can you get that for me? Isabella, please be careful. These are dangerous people. If they are hiding something about Thomas, they won't hesitate to protect that secret." "I don't care about the danger," Isabella said firmly. "Thomas was a scared little boy who reached out for help and no one answered. Someone needs to answer now. Someone needs to find out what happened to him." Sister Margaret reached into her habit and pulled out a worn address book. She copied information onto a piece of paper with shaking hands. "His office is downtown. But Isabella, please promise me you'll be careful. And please, if you find out what happened to Thomas, come back and tell me. I've carried this guilt for 15 years. I need to know if he's all right." "I promise," Isabella said, taking the paper. As she left the chapel, Isabella felt the weight of purpose settling onto her shoulders. She was no longer just a dismissed maid seeking answers. She was now the voice for a child who'd been silenced, the advocate for a boy who'd been erased, the seeker of a truth that powerful people had buried. Outside the orphanage, Isabella pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Carlos Rodriguez speaking." "Carlos, it's Isabella Martinez, from St. Catherine's. Do you remember me?" There was a pause, then recognition. "Isabella? Of course. It's been years. How are you?" Carlos had been another orphanage kid, a few years older than Isabella. Unlike her, he'd managed to claw his way into a career, investigative journalism for a local newspaper. They'd kept in loose touch over the years, the bond of shared childhood trauma, creating a connection that time couldn't completely sever. "Carlos, I need your help. I've stumbled onto something big, something involving the Worthington family. I think they're hiding a secret about a child, and I need someone with resources to help me investigate." "The Worthingtons?" Carlos's voice sharpened with professional interest. "Isabella, those are serious people. What kind of secret are we talking about? The kind that involves forged adoptions, missing children, and lawyers who specialize in making problems disappear. Can you help me?" There was a long pause. Then, "Where are you? Let's meet. You can tell me everything." An hour later, Isabella sat across from Carlos in a small coffee shop far from the wealthy districts and their watchful eyes. She told him everything: the portrait, the confrontation, Sister Margaret's story, the mysterious letter. Carlos listened with the focused attention of a journalist who recognized a major story when he heard one. "This is huge," he said when she finished. "If the Worthingtons illegally adopted or are hiding a child, if there's any hint of impropriety, Isabella, this could be the story of the year. But it's also dangerous. These people don't play by the same rules as the rest of us." "I don't care about danger," Isabella said. "I care about Thomas. Carlos, he was just a little boy. Whatever they did to him, whatever they're still doing, he deserves someone to fight for him." Carlos studied her face for a long moment. "Okay, I'm in. But we do this carefully. We gather evidence, we build a case, and we don't move until we have enough to protect ourselves from their lawyers. Agreed?" "Agreed." "First step," Carlos said, pulling out a laptop. We find out everything we can about Richard Blackwood and his connection to the Worthingtons. Then we start tracing what happened to Thomas Patterson after he left that orphanage. As they began their research, neither of them noticed the man in the corner of the coffee shop, seemingly absorbed in his newspaper, but actually photographing them with a phone hidden beneath the pages. Within minutes, those photographs would be on Jonathan Worthington's desk, along with a message. The maid is asking questions. She has help now. The war for Thomas's truth had begun, and Isabella Martinez, despite having nothing but determination, had just declared herself an enemy of one of the most powerful families in the city. But what she didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the truth about Thomas was far darker and more complex than even her worst fears could conjure. The law offices of Blackwood and Associates occupied the entire 30th floor of the Sterling Tower, one of those gleaming monuments to corporate power that dominated the downtown skyline. Isabella stood on the marble-floored lobby, staring at the directory, with a mixture of determination and dread. Everything about this building screamed money and influence, from the waterfall feature in the atrium to the security guards whose uniforms probably cost more than her monthly rent. "You ready for this?" Carlos asked beside her, his journalist's notebook tucked discreetly in his jacket pocket. They'd agreed he would accompany her, posing as her legal counsel. It was a thin disguise, but better than nothing. "No," Isabella admitted honestly, "but that's never stopped me before." The elevator ride to the 30th floor felt like ascending into another atmosphere, one where the air itself was different, thinner, colder, filtered through systems that cost more than most people's cars. When the doors opened, they were greeted by a reception area that looked more like a luxury hotel than a law office. Expensive art adorned the walls, and the receptionist sat behind a desk that appeared to be carved from a single piece of rare wood. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked with the polite disinterest of someone trained to filter out people who didn't belong in spaces like this. "I need to speak with Richard Blackwood," Isabella said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's about a case he handled 15 years ago." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but this is urgent. It concerns a child's welfare." The receptionist's expression didn't change, but her fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Blackwood's schedule is completely booked for the next 3 months. If you'd like to leave your contact information, someone from his office will reach out to schedule a consultation. Our initial meeting fee is $5,000. $5,000. The number hit Isabella like a physical blow. That was nearly 3 months of her former salary, gone in a single hour of this man's time. "Please," Isabella leaned forward, desperation creeping into her voice. "I just need 5 minutes. It's about Thomas Patterson, a boy he brought to St. Catherine's Orphanage 15 years ago." The change in the receptionist's demeanor was instant and unmistakable. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked like alarm. She quickly recovered, but not before Isabella and Carlos had both noticed. "I'm afraid Mr. Blackwood is unavailable," she said, her voice now carrying an edge of finality. "If you don't have an appointment, I'll have to ask you to leave." "Just tell him the name," Isabella pressed. "Thomas Patterson. Tell him someone is asking questions about what happened to that child." "Security." The receptionist spoke into her phone, her eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "I need assistance at the main reception." Carlos touched Isabella's arm gently. "We should go. We're not going to get anywhere this way." But as they turned toward the elevator, a door opened down the hallway. A man emerged, tall, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of wielding power in courtrooms and boardrooms. Richard Blackwood himself, drawn out by the commotion. "What's going on here, Jennifer?" he asked the receptionist, but his eyes were fixed on Isabella with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "These people don't have an appointment, Mr. Blackwood. They're just leaving." "Wait," Blackwood said, studying Isabella's face with calculation that reminded her uncomfortably of Jonathan Worthington. "You mentioned Thomas Patterson. How do you know that name?" Isabella felt Carlos tense beside her, a warning to be careful. But she was past careful. "I knew him. I lived with him at St. Catherine's Orphanage. You brought him there in the middle of the night and then took him away just as secretly. I want to know what happened to him." Something flickered across Blackwood's face. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. He glanced at the security guards who had arrived, then back at Isabella. "Jennifer, Cancel my next appointment. I'll give these people 10 minutes. The receptionist looked shocked. But Mr. Blackwood, 10 minutes, he repeated firmly, then gestured toward his office. This way. Richard Blackwood's private office was exactly what Isabella had expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the entire city. Furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year. Shelves lined with leather-bound law books that probably hadn't been opened in decades. He settled behind his massive desk with the ease of someone completely comfortable in their dominion. You have 10 minutes, he said, checking an expensive watch. I suggest you use them wisely. Where is Thomas Pattison? Isabella asked directly. What happened to him after you took him from St. Catherine's? Blackwood's expression remained carefully neutral, but Isabella had spent years reading the micro-expressions of wealthy people trying to hide their true feelings. She saw the tightening around his eyes, the slight tensing of his jaw. I'm afraid I don't discuss former clients or their cases, he said smoothly. Attorney-client privilege, you understand. Thomas was a child, Carlos interjected, his journalist's instincts kicking in. A 7-year-old boy. Attorney-client privilege doesn't apply when a child's welfare might be at risk. Are you suggesting that a child's welfare was at risk? Blackwood's voice became sharp, dangerous. That's a serious allegation. I hope you have evidence to support such claims, or you're opening yourselves up to substantial legal consequences. Isabella refused to be intimidated. I'm saying that a child was moved in secret, adopted in secret, and then apparently erased from existence. The Worthingtons have a portrait of him on their wall, but I've never seen or heard of him being part of their family. That's suspicious enough to warrant questions. At the mention of the Worthington name, Blackwood's professional mask slipped slightly. How do you know about the Worthingtons? Because I worked for them, Isabella said. Until yesterday, when I recognized Thomas's portrait and asked questions. They fired me immediately and tried to have me sign a non-disclosure agreement. That's not how innocent people behave. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful. Miss Martinez, Isabella Martinez. Miss Martinez, I'm going to tell you something, not because I have to, but because I believe you genuinely care about the child you knew. Yes, I handled certain legal matters involving a minor and the Worthington family 15 years ago. Yes, those matters were confidential, but everything I did was legal, proper, and in accordance with the law. The child in question was placed in a situation that provided him with opportunities he never would have had otherwise. Then where is he now? Isabella demanded. If he's thriving with the Worthingtons, why have I never seen him? Why is he only present in a portrait? That's not information I'm at liberty to discuss. Can't discuss or won't discuss? Carlos challenged. Blackwood stood, signaling that the meeting was over. Your 10 minutes are up. I suggest you both leave now before I have you escorted out. We're not going to stop asking questions, Isabella said, standing her ground. Someone needs to speak for Thomas, even if it's 15 years too late. Miss Martinez, Blackwood's voice dropped to a tone that was almost gentle, but carried an unmistakable threat. Let me give you some free legal advice. The Worthingtons are extremely powerful people with extensive resources. If you continue to harass them with these unfounded questions, they will crush you. They will sue you into oblivion. They will destroy your reputation, your employment prospects, your entire life. Is satisfying your curiosity really worth that price? It's not about curiosity, Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the fear his words generated. It's about a child who asked for help and didn't get it. It's about truth and accountability. Truth is expensive, Miss Martinez. More expensive than you can afford. Blackwood pressed a button on his desk. Security will show you out. As they were escorted from the building, Isabella's hands were shaking. Carlos put a supportive hand on her shoulder once they reached the street. That went better than I expected, he said. Better? He threatened us and told us nothing. He told us everything, Carlos corrected. Did you see his reaction when you mentioned the portrait? When you said Thomas isn't present in the Worthington family? He didn't deny it. A good lawyer would have shut that down immediately if it wasn't true. Instead, he dodged and deflected. Isabella processed this. So you think Thomas isn't living with them? I think something happened to Thomas, and whatever it is, the Worthingtons are desperate to keep it hidden. Blackwood's threats weren't just legal posturing. He was genuinely warning us that pursuing this will have consequences. They walked several blocks in silence before Carlos spoke again. I spent yesterday digging through public records. Want to know what I found? Everything. The Worthingtons had a son who died about 16 years ago. His name was Christopher Worthington. He would have been about 7 years old. The death was ruled accidental, a drowning in their pool. Isabella stopped walking, her heart beginning to race. The same age Thomas was when he arrived at the orphanage. Exactly. Now here's where it gets interesting. I found the death certificate, the coroner's report, news articles about the tragedy. But then, about 6 months after Christopher's death, there's a complete news blackout. The Worthingtons, who had been very public in their grief, suddenly disappeared from society events. They traveled extensively for almost a year, and when they came back, they never mentioned Christopher again. No memorial services, no charitable foundations in his name, nothing. It's like they erased him from their history. And that's when Thomas arrived at the orphanage, Isabella breathed. 6 months after Christopher died. I haven't been able to prove a direct connection yet, but the timing is suspicious. A wealthy couple loses their son. Months later, a boy who looks similar, based on the portrait you described, appears in an orphanage under mysterious circumstances. Then that same boy is secretly adopted, presumably by the same couple. You think Thomas was a replacement, Isabella said, horror dawning. They lost Christopher and found a child who could take his place. It's just a theory, Carlos cautioned, but it would explain the secrecy. It would explain why they don't acknowledge him publicly, because officially Christopher is dead and they never adopted anyone else. The question is, where is Thomas now? If he was raised as their son, why isn't he visible? Why just a portrait? Isabella felt sick. Carlos, what if something happened to him? What if he died too, and that's what they're hiding? That's one possibility. But there's another theory that might be even worse. What? What if Thomas is still alive, but they're keeping him hidden for some reason? What if he's being held somewhere, isolated, unable to leave or speak for himself? The implications of that scenario were too horrible to fully contemplate. Isabella leaned against a building, trying to process everything. We need more proof. We need something concrete. I'm working on it. I have a contact in the coroner's office who might be able to get me more details about Christopher's death. And I'm trying to track down anyone who worked for the Worthingtons around that time. Servants, staff, people who might have seen something. I need to do something too, Isabella said. I can't just sit around waiting. Actually, there's something you can do. The Worthington mansion. You worked there. Do you remember the layout? Security systems? Any places where records might be kept? Isabella's eyes widened. You're not suggesting. I'm suggesting that sometimes the only way to get truth is to take it. But I need to know if it's even feasible. Before Isabella could respond, her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Miss Martinez? An unfamiliar female voice. My name is Patricia Hendricks. I used to work for the Worthington family. I heard through certain channels that you're asking questions about a boy from 15 years ago. We need to meet. Tonight. But it has to be somewhere public. And you can't tell anyone. Who gave you my number? That doesn't matter. What matters is that I have information you need. 7 o'clock Bennett Park, near the fountain. Come alone, or I won't show. The line went dead. Isabella looked at Carlos with wide eyes. Someone wants to talk. Someone who worked for the Worthingtons. It could be a trap. Or it could be the break we need. Isabella checked her watch. I have 4 hours to decide if I'm brave enough to find out which. Those 4 hours passed in agonizing slowness. Isabella returned to her apartment, where her mother had prepared a simple meal that neither of them had much appetite for. Rosa could see the turmoil in her daughter's face. Mija, you look terrified, Rosa said gently. Maybe it's time to stop this. Maybe some truths are too dangerous to pursue. Mama, what if it was me? Isabella asked. What if I had disappeared as a child, and years later someone had the chance to find out what happened to me? Wouldn't you want them to try? Rosa was quiet, her weathered hands trembling slightly. Of course I would, but I'd also want them to stay safe. These people have already cost you your job. What if they cost you more? Then at least I'll know I tried, Isabella said softly. Thomas deserves that much. Bennett Park was one of those urban green spaces that cities created to give the illusion of nature amidst concrete and steel. By 7 o'clock, the autumn evening had turned cool, and most of the afternoon visitors had gone home. Isabella sat on a bench near the fountain, her heart pounding, hyper-aware of every person who passed by. At 7:15, she was beginning to think Patricia Hendricks wouldn't show. Then a woman appeared, moving quickly, glancing around nervously. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with an anxious expression that matched her hurried movements. "Isabella Martinez?" she asked in a hushed voice. "Patricia Hendricks?" The woman sat down, positioning herself so she could watch the park's entrance. "I shouldn't be here. If they find out I'm talking to you." "Who are they?" "The Worthingtons. They're lawyers. They're security people. They have ways of knowing things, of controlling people." Patricia's hands twisted together anxiously. "I worked as their head housekeeper for 12 years. I saw things I've spent 15 years trying to forget. Things about Thomas." Patricia flinched at the name. "Is that what they called him at the orphanage? Thomas? You knew him by a different name?" "They called him Christopher. The entire staff was told he was Christopher, returned to them by some miracle. But I knew it was impossible. I had dressed Christopher's body for the funeral. I knew that child was dead." Isabella felt her breath catch. "They pretended he was their dead son?" "Not at first. When the new boy first arrived, it was supposed to be temporary. Mrs. Worthington had suffered a complete breakdown after Christopher's death. The doctors said she was having delusions, refusing to accept that her son was gone. Mr. Worthington hired specialists, tried everything. Then someone, I don't know who, suggested they find a child who looked similar to Christopher, just to help Mrs. Worthington transition, to give her something to focus on while she healed. That's insane. That's what I thought. But Mr. Worthington was desperate. He loved his wife, and he was watching her destroy herself with grief. So they found a boy through private channels, a child from difficult circumstances who wouldn't be missed, a child who looked enough like Christopher that Mrs. Worthington, in her fragile state, might accept him as a comfort. "Thomas," Isabella whispered. "They brought him to the house, told Mrs. Worthington that Christopher had been found, that there had been a terrible mistake, that he'd been confused and wandering but was home now. And she believed it, or wanted to believe it so badly that she convinced herself it was true. What happened to him? Where is he now?" Patricia's face crumpled with an emotion that looked like guilt mixed with terror. "That's why I had to talk to you. That's why I haven't been able to sleep properly for 15 years. Miss Martinez, something went wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. And I've been too afraid to tell anyone until I heard you were asking questions. Until I realized someone finally cared enough about that boy to demand answers. Tell me," Isabella urged. "Please." Patricia looked around once more, then leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "The boy tried to run away. About a year after they brought him there. He'd figured out he wasn't really their son, that he was being kept as some kind of replacement. He managed to get out of the mansion one night and made it several blocks before their security found him. And Mr. Worthington made a decision. He said the boy was a risk, that he couldn't be trusted, that if he told anyone about the situation, it would destroy everything. His wife's fragile recovery, his reputation, his family's legacy. So he made arrangements, permanent arrangements." Isabella felt her blood turn to ice. "What kind of arrangements?" But before Patricia could answer, a car screeched to a stop at the park's entrance. Two large men in professional attire emerged, their eyes scanning the area with practiced efficiency. "They found us," Patricia gasped. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was careful. I thought—" She stood abruptly and began walking quickly in the opposite direction. Isabella wanted to follow, wanted to hear the rest of the story, but the two men were already approaching with purpose. "Miss Martinez," one of them said, his voice professionally polite but carrying an unmistakable threat. "Mr. Worthington would like to speak with you. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Isabella's heart raced. She was in a public park, but it was nearly empty now. She pulled out her phone. "One step closer and I'm calling the police," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Go ahead," the man said, "and explain to them why you've been harassing a prominent family, trespassing on their property, and making slanderous accusations. Mr. Worthington has very good lawyers. Do you?" Isabella realized she was trapped. These men weren't going to physically harm her in a public space. They didn't need to. They had resources, legal power, connections that she couldn't match. "What does he want?" she asked. "To talk. Just talk. He believes there's been a misunderstanding, and he'd like to clear it up directly." Everything in Isabella screamed that this was dangerous, that going with these men was a terrible idea. But another part of her, the part that had spent days searching for answers, saw this as an opportunity. Jonathan Worthington wanted to talk to her directly. Maybe, just maybe, she could get him to reveal something, to let slip some detail that would crack this case wide open. "Fine," she said, "but I'm telling someone where I'm going, and if I don't check in with them within an hour, they're calling the police." She quickly texted Carlos with the details, knowing that at least someone would know what happened to her if this went badly. "That's fine," the man said. "We're not kidnapping you, Miss Martinez. We're just facilitating a conversation. The car is this way." As Isabella was led to the black luxury sedan, she looked back once to see if Patricia was still visible. But the former housekeeper had disappeared into the evening shadows, leaving behind only the beginning of a story that promised to be far darker than anything Isabella had imagined. The truth about Thomas was close now. She could feel it. But as the car pulled away from Bennett Park, heading toward an unknown destination, Isabella wondered if some truths came with a price too high to pay. The luxury sedan moved through the city streets with the smooth silence that only expensive German engineering could provide. Isabella sat in the back seat between the two security personnel, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Through the tinted windows, she watched the familiar neighborhoods give way to areas she'd only seen from bus windows, districts where every building seemed to whisper of old money and older secrets. "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Somewhere private," the man to her left responded. "Somewhere you and Mr. Worthington can talk without interruption." The car eventually pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a building that Isabella didn't recognize. They took a private elevator that required a key card to operate, ascending in silence that felt increasingly oppressive. When the doors opened, they revealed a penthouse office that made Richard Blackwood's setup look modest by comparison. Jonathan Worthington stood with his back to them, gazing out floor-to-ceiling windows at the city spread below like a kingdom he ruled. He didn't turn immediately when they entered, letting the silence stretch, demonstrating his control over the situation, over her, over everything. "Thank you, gentlemen," he finally said. "Wait outside. Miss Martinez and I need to speak privately." The security personnel left without a word, closing the heavy door behind them with a definitive click. Isabella found herself alone with one of the most powerful men in the city, in a place no one knew about, with nothing but her phone and her determination to protect her. "Sit," Jonathan said, still not turning around. It wasn't a request. Isabella remained standing. "I'd prefer not to." That got his attention. He turned, and Isabella saw that the arrogant mask he'd worn during their first encounter had been replaced by something more complex. Exhaustion, mixed with desperation, and something that might have been fear. "You've been very persistent, Miss Martinez," he said, moving to a bar cart and pouring himself a drink. He didn't offer her one. Asking questions, meeting with people, digging into matters that don't concern you. "Thomas concerns me," Isabella said firmly. "He was my friend when we were children. He deserves someone to care about what happened to him." "Thomas?" Jonathan repeated the name like it tasted bitter. "You keep calling him that. We called him Christopher, because you were pretending he was your dead son." Jonathan's hand tightened on his glass. "I see Patricia has been talking. That's unfortunate. For her." The casual threat in his voice made Isabella's blood run cold, but she refused to back down. "Where is he? Where is Thomas? Is he even alive?" Jonathan took a long drink before responding. "What do you think happened to him?" "I think you bought a child to replace the son you lost. I think when he tried to escape, when he threatened to expose your secret, you did something to him. Something permanent. You've been watching too many crime dramas, Miss Martinez." Jonathan set down his glass and moved closer to her. "The truth is far more complicated than your simplistic theories." "Then tell me the truth." "Why? What gives you the right to know about my family's private matters?" "Because Thomas was a human being, not a toy you could buy and discard when he became inconvenient." Isabella's voice rose with emotion. "He was a scared little boy who'd already lost everything, and you used him like he was disposable." "I saved him," Jonathan's composure cracked, his voice thundering through the office. Do you understand that? That orphanage was a warehouse for damaged children going nowhere. I gave him opportunities, education, a home that most people would kill to have. A home. You kept him as a replacement for your dead son. You forced him to pretend to be someone he wasn't. That's not saving him. That's imprisoning him. Jonathan's face flushed with anger, but beneath it, Isabella saw something else. Guilt that had been festering for 15 years. My wife was dying. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. She'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped living after Christopher drowned. The doctors said she wouldn't survive much longer if something didn't change. He moved back to the window, his voice becoming quieter, more controlled. So, yes, I made an arrangement. I found a child who resembled Christopher. I brought him into our home. I told my wife that there had been a mistake, that Christopher was alive, and she believed it because she needed to believe it. And she started eating again, started sleeping, started living. At the cost of Thomas's identity, his freedom, his entire life, Isabella said. He was 7 years old, living in an institution with no future ahead of him, Jonathan countered. I gave him private tutors, the best education money could buy, everything a child could need, except the truth, except his name, except the right to be himself. Jonathan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years of rationalization. It was supposed to be temporary, just until Margaret stabilized, but the longer it went on, the deeper we got. Margaret became attached to him. He learned to play the role, and I convinced myself it was working, that everyone was benefiting, until he tried to run away. Jonathan's shoulders sagged slightly. He was smart, smarter than we'd anticipated. As he got older, he started asking questions, noticing inconsistencies in the stories we told him, finding ways to access information we'd tried to keep from him. And yes, eventually, he tried to leave. What did you do to him? Isabella pressed. Where is he now? I couldn't let him go, Jonathan said quietly. If he'd told anyone the truth, about the substitution, about the deception, it would have destroyed everything. Margaret would have been devastated. Our reputation would have been ruined. There would have been investigations, legal consequences, potential criminal charges. So you killed him. Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. No, Jonathan spun around, his face a mask of genuine anguish. I'm many things, Miss Martinez, but I'm not a murderer. I couldn't let him leave, but I couldn't do that. Then where is he? Jonathan moved to his desk and pulled out a photograph from a locked drawer. He stared at it for a long moment before handing it to Isabella. This is where he is. Isabella took the photograph with trembling hands. It showed a modern institutional building, clinical and isolated, surrounded by high fences and manicured grounds. It looked like a hospital, but something about it felt wrong, too secure, too remote. Whitehaven Residential Treatment Facility, Jonathan said. About 200 miles from here. It's a private institution that specializes in difficult cases, young adults who need long-term care and supervision. You had him committed, Isabella breathed, horror washing over her. I had him placed somewhere he could receive appropriate care, Jonathan corrected. When he tried to run away, when he started threatening to tell people who he really was, the doctors I consulted suggested he was displaying signs of serious psychological issues, identity confusion, delusions, attachment disorders. It wasn't difficult to build a medical case for residential treatment. He wasn't delusional. He was telling the truth. According to the official medical records, Christopher Worthington suffered a severe psychological break following the trauma of the accident that supposedly caused his temporary disappearance. His claims of being someone else named Thomas were diagnosed as dissociative identity disorder. His insistence that he wasn't our son was classified as rejection of traumatic memories. The elegant cruelty of it took Isabella's breath away. You had him declared mentally ill for telling the truth about who he was. I did what I had to do to protect my family, Jonathan said, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. I told myself he would receive good care, that he would be safe there, that maybe with enough time and therapy, he could adjust, accept his situation. How long has he been there? Jonathan's silence was answer enough. 14 years. Isabella whispered in horror. You've kept him locked up for 14 years. He receives excellent care. The facility is top-rated. He has everything he needs. Except freedom. Except the truth. Except his life. Isabella felt tears streaming down her face. He's been imprisoned since he was 8 years old, because you couldn't face the consequences of your choices. What would you have me do? Jonathan's voice rose again. Release him now. Tell the world that I kidnapped a child, forced him to impersonate my dead son, and then had him institutionalized when he resisted. I'd go to prison. Margaret would be destroyed. Our entire family would be ruined. And Thomas, what about what this has done to him? He's stable, medicated, adjusted to his environment. The doctors say he rarely mentions his previous claims anymore. He's at peace. He's been broken, Isabella said, her voice thick with grief and rage. You broke a child and call it peace. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan moved back to the windows, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. When he spoke again, his voice was hollow. I brought you here to make you an offer. $2 million. More money than you'll ever see in your lifetime. In exchange, you stop asking questions. You forget about Thomas. You sign legal documents guaranteeing your silence. You disappear from this situation and never look back. Isabella stared at him in disbelief. You think you can buy my silence? I can buy anything, Miss Martinez. Everyone has a price. What's yours? 3 million? 5? Name it. I want you to free him, Isabella said. I want you to acknowledge what you did, get him real help, and give him back his life. That's not possible. Then we have nothing to talk about. Isabella turned toward the door. Wait. Jonathan's voice stopped her. You don't understand what you're doing. If you pursue this, if you try to expose this situation, you won't just hurt me. You'll hurt him too. The scandal, the media attention, the investigations, it will traumatize him all over again. He's fragile. He won't survive being dragged through all of that. Isabella turned back. Or maybe that's just what you tell yourself to justify keeping him buried. Maybe what he needs is someone willing to fight for him, no matter the consequences. You're going to destroy lives, Jonathan said. Mine, Margaret's, and most of all his. Is your sense of righteousness really worth that price? I don't know yet, Isabella admitted honestly. But I know that leaving him in that place, locked away and forgotten, definitely isn't right. Someone needs to speak for him. And apparently, I'm the only one willing to. She walked to the door and found it unlocked. The security guards were gone. Jonathan had let them leave, perhaps knowing this confrontation needed to happen privately. Miss Martinez, Jonathan called as she reached the elevator. One more thing. That former employee who spoke to you, Patricia Hendricks. She's violated her non-disclosure agreement. My lawyers will be pursuing action against her. I thought you should know the consequences your investigation is having on others. The threat was clear. Anyone who helped Isabella would pay the price. The elevator ride down felt longer than the trip up. Isabella's mind reeled with everything she'd learned. Thomas was alive. He'd been alive this whole time, locked away in an institution, labeled as mentally ill for refusing to pretend to be someone else, punished for trying to reclaim his identity. When she emerged onto the street, she immediately called Carlos. He answered on the first ring. Are you okay? It's been over an hour. I was about to call the police. I'm fine. Carlos, I know where he is. I know where Thomas is. She told him everything. The facility, the false diagnosis, the 14 years of imprisonment disguised as treatment. Carlos was silent for a long moment after she finished. This is bigger than I thought, he finally said. If we expose this, it's not just a scandal. It's multiple felonies, kidnapping, false imprisonment, medical fraud. The Worthingtons will go to prison. Good, Isabella said fiercely. But Isabella, you need to understand what you're starting. They'll fight with everything they have. They'll destroy your reputation, claim you're extorting them, dig up every mistake you've ever made, and they'll use their influence to discredit anything we publish. I don't care. And there's something else. If Thomas has really been institutionalized for 14 years, if he's been on psychiatric medications, if he's been told he's delusional for claiming his real identity, he might not be able to help us. He might not even remember the truth clearly anymore. The thought made Isabella's heart ache. What had they done to him in 14 years? How much of the bright, scared little boy she'd known still existed? "We have to try," she said. "Carlos, we have to at least try." "Okay," Carlos agreed. "Tomorrow we start gathering evidence. Real evidence that can stand up in court. We document everything. And then we go public with a story so airtight that not even the Worthingtons' lawyers can make it disappear." That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Thomas locked away in that facility, probably wondering if anyone in the world remembered him, cared about him, would fight for him. "I remember you," she whispered into the darkness. "And I'm going to get you out, I promise." It was a promise that would either save them both or destroy everything she had left. But for Thomas, for the scared little boy who'd once held her hand during thunderstorms, she would risk it all. The days following Isabella's meeting with Jonathan Worthington blurred together in a frenzied marathon of investigation and documentation. Carlos worked his journalist contacts while Isabella reached out to everyone she could find who'd had any connection to the Worthington household during those crucial years. Each conversation, each document, each piece of evidence added another brick to the wall of truth they were building. Patricia Hendricks, despite Jonathan's threats, agreed to provide a sworn statement. 3 other former household employees, emboldened by her courage, came forward with their own accounts. The picture they painted was damning. A child brought into the home under mysterious circumstances, isolated from the outside world, gradually transformed into a prisoner of a fantasy that benefited everyone except him. Carlos's investigation into Whitehaven Residential Treatment Facility revealed troubling patterns. The institution, while legally operating and properly licensed, had a history of housing patients whose families wanted them kept quiet. The wealthy and powerful didn't just send their mentally ill relatives there. They sent their inconvenient truths, their scandals waiting to happen, their secrets that needed to stay buried. "I spoke to a former staff member," Carlos told Isabella one evening, as they compiled their evidence in his small apartment. She wouldn't go on record, but she remembered Thomas, or Christopher as they called him. She said he was one of the saddest cases she'd ever seen. A young man who insisted he'd been kidnapped and held against his will, but all his medical records labeled him as delusional. She said he eventually stopped fighting, stopped claiming his real identity, just gave up. Isabella felt her chest tighten with grief. "How do we get him out? Can we go to the police now?" "Not yet. Everything we have is circumstantial. Former employees with axes to grind, medical records that could be interpreted multiple ways, a wealthy family with resources to fight back. We need something irrefutable. We need Thomas himself." "Then we go to him," Isabella said. "We visit the facility and talk to him directly." "Isabella, they're not going to let random people visit a patient, especially not when that patient's family has specifically restricted access." "Then we don't ask for permission." Carlos looked at her with surprise. "You're suggesting we break into a secure medical facility?" "I'm suggesting we find Thomas and give him a choice. The choice he's never had, to tell his story in his own words. And if he can't or won't, then at least we tried. At least someone finally came for him." It took 3 days to plan. Carlos had discovered that Whitehaven allowed volunteer visits from a local religious organization once a week. With carefully forged credentials and a lot of nerve, Isabella and Carlos joined the volunteer group on their next scheduled visit. The drive to Whitehaven took them far from the city, through countryside that gradually became more isolated. The facility itself was exactly as Isabella had seen in the photograph, modern, clean, and surrounded by fencing that was decorative but unmistakably meant to keep people inside. The volunteer coordinator, a cheerful woman named Susan, briefed them on protocols. "Most of our residents appreciate the company, but remember they're here for serious mental health treatment. Don't challenge their beliefs or upset their routines. Just provide companionship and kindness." The inside of Whitehaven was less clinical than Isabella had feared, more like an upscale hotel than a hospital. But there were cameras everywhere, staff members monitoring every corridor, and doors that required key cards to open. This was a prison wearing the mask of a wellness retreat. "How do we find him?" Isabella whispered to Carlos as they moved through the facility with the volunteer group. "The directory I hacked listed him in the East Wing, 3rd floor, room 347. But we need to separate from the group without drawing attention. Their opportunity came when the volunteers split up to visit different common areas. Isabella excused herself to use the restroom, and Carlos created a distraction by asking detailed questions about the facility's art therapy program. In the confusion, Isabella slipped away toward the East Wing stairwell. Her heart pounded as she climbed to the third floor. At any moment, someone could stop her, question her presence, call security. But the hallway was quiet, most patients presumably in group therapy or afternoon activities. Room 347 had a small window in the door. Isabella approached slowly, her hands trembling. Through the window, she could see a young man sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the grounds beyond. He was thin, with posture that spoke of years of resignation. His face was turned away, but something about him, the shape of his head, the set of his shoulders, made Isabella's breath catch. She knocked softly on the door. The young man didn't turn immediately. When he finally did, Isabella found herself looking at a face that was simultaneously familiar and heartbreakingly changed. Thomas Patterson, now 22 years old, had grown into the promise of the child she'd known, but his eyes held a deadness that no young person's eyes should contain. "I'm not scheduled for therapy," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "You must have the wrong room." Isabella opened the door slowly, stepping inside. "Thomas? Thomas Patterson?" The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. His entire body went rigid, his eyes widening with something that looked like terror mixed with desperate hope. "No," he whispered. "My name is Christopher. Christopher Worthington. That's what everyone says. That's what the records show. I'm not. I can't be." "You are," Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. "You're Thomas Patterson. You lived at St. Catherine's Orphanage 15 years ago. You used to have nightmares about drowning. You hid food under your mattress. And I'm Isabella Martinez. I held your hand during thunderstorms." Thomas's breathing became rapid, panicked. "No, no, no, you're a test. They send tests sometimes to see if I'm better, if I still have the delusions. I'm better now. I don't have the delusions anymore. My name is Christopher Worthington. Thomas, listen to me." Isabella moved closer, but not too close. "I know what they did to you. I know they told you that your memories were false, that your real name was a delusion. But it wasn't. You're Thomas Patterson. And I've spent weeks trying to find you because you matter, because you deserved someone to come for you. If I agree with you, they'll increase my medication," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "If I say I'm Thomas, they'll say I'm regressing. I've learned to be Christopher. I've learned to stop fighting. Please don't make me fight again. I'm too tired to fight anymore." The defeat in his voice shattered something inside Isabella. This was what Jonathan Worthington had done, broken a human being so thoroughly that he was afraid to even claim his own identity. "What if you didn't have to fight?" Isabella asked gently. "What if I told you that people outside this place know the truth, that we have evidence of what was done to you, that we can get you out of here?" Thomas laughed, but it was a hollow, broken sound. "No one gets out of Whitehaven. Not when their family pays as much as mine does. Not when the doctors believe you're a danger to yourself. I tried to tell the truth when I first got here. I tried to explain. But the more I explained, the crazier they said I was. Eventually, I learned to stop explaining, to accept, to surrender." "I'm not asking you to explain," Isabella said. "I'm asking you to make a choice, right now. Come with me. Walk out of this facility. Tell your story to the world. Or stay here. Stay safe. Stay medicated. But know that if you stay, you're choosing to remain Thomas Patterson who was erased. And if you leave, you're choosing to become Thomas Patterson who was found." "They'll stop us," Thomas whispered. "They have cameras everywhere. Security. They'll catch us before we reach the exit." "Maybe," Isabella admitted. "But maybe not. And either way, at least you'll have tried. At least you'll have chosen." For a long moment, Thomas sat frozen. Decades of conditioning warring with the desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone was offering him a way out. Then, slowly, he stood up. "I used to dream someone would come," he said quietly. "In the beginning, before the medication made the dreams stop. I used to imagine that one of the kids from the orphanage would remember me, would look for me. And it was always you, Isabella. You were always the one who came in my dreams. Then let's make the dream real, Isabella said, extending her hand. Thomas stared at her hand for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then he reached out and took it. His grip was weak, uncertain, but it was a grip nonetheless. "My name is Thomas Patterson," he said, and tears began streaming down his face. "My name is Thomas Patterson, and I've been locked away for 14 years for refusing to forget who I am." They moved quickly through the corridors, Isabella guiding Thomas while trying to appear casual, unhurried. But alarms began sounding before they reached the stairwell. Someone had noticed the patient missing from room 347. "Run," Isabella urged, and they ran. Security personnel appeared at the end of the corridor. Thomas hesitated, 14 years of obedience struggling against his desperate bid for freedom. But Isabella pulled him forward, and something in him broke free. The child who'd once tried to run, who'd once believed escape was possible. They burst through a side door, setting off more alarms. The ground stretched before them, deceptively beautiful, the fence line visible in the distance. Behind them, security guards shouted orders, radioed for backup, began pursuit. But they had one advantage. Carlos had positioned their car at a maintenance gate he'd identified in his research. If they could reach it before security locked down the entire facility, they had a chance. Thomas ran like someone who'd forgotten how, his body weak from years of sedentary institutional life, but his determination carrying him forward. Isabella pulled him along, refusing to let him fall behind, refusing to leave him. They crashed through bushes, stumbled over decorative rocks, pushed through the manicured landscape that had been Thomas's only view of the outside world for so many years. And then they saw it. Carlos's car at the maintenance gate, engine running, Carlos waving frantically. Security was closing in behind them. Voices shouted for them to stop, warned them about the consequences. But Isabella and Thomas reached the car and threw themselves inside. "Drive!" Isabella screamed, and Carlos drove. They burst through the maintenance gate, which hadn't been properly secured, and onto the access road beyond. Behind them, Whitehaven's security vehicles began pursuit. But Carlos knew these roads from his research. He took turns that larger vehicles couldn't follow, used shortcuts that bought them precious minutes, and eventually they lost their pursuers. In the back seat, Thomas was hyperventilating, years of controlled environment shattering around him. "What did I do?" he gasped. "What did we do? They'll say I'm dangerous. They'll say I need to be restrained. They'll bring me back." "Not this time," Isabella said firmly. "This time, the whole world is going to hear your story, and they can't silence all of us." Carlos drove them directly to the offices of the major newspaper where he worked. His editor, a hard-nosed woman named Patricia Simmons, had been briefed on the story, but was skeptical until she saw Thomas in person, a young man who'd been erased from existence, sitting in her office ready to tell the truth. "This is going to be the story of the decade," Patricia said, her journalist's instincts fully activated. "But we need to move fast. The Worthingtons will have lawyers filing injunctions within hours. We publish tonight, online first, with every piece of evidence you've gathered. By morning, this story will be everywhere, and it will be too late for them to stop it." The interview took hours. Thomas spoke haltingly at first, years of being told his memories were false making him doubt every word. But Isabella sat beside him. Carlos recorded everything, and gradually, the full horror of his story emerged. The article went live at midnight. By dawn, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. By noon, it was national news. Television crews camped outside the Worthington mansion. Politicians called for investigations. Mental health advocates demanded reforms. And the public, outraged by the story of a child stolen and broken by wealth and power, demanded justice. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and brutal. Jonathan Worthington was arrested on charges of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and medical fraud. Richard Blackwood faced disbarment and criminal charges. Whitehaven Residential Treatment Facility underwent federal investigation. Margaret Worthington, whose grief had been weaponized to justify such cruelty, suffered a complete breakdown and was herself hospitalized, this time genuinely. But the most important proceeding happened in a small courtroom where a judge reviewed Thomas Patterson's case and made a simple declaration. This young man's civil rights were violated in the most egregious manner possible. His identity was stolen, his freedom taken, his voice silenced. Today we return what was taken. Today, Thomas Patterson is legally recognized as himself. Free, autonomous, human. The restoration of his legal identity was just the beginning. Thomas faced years of therapy ahead. Years of learning to trust his own memories. Years of recovering from the psychological damage of 14 years of institutionalization. But he faced it with Isabella beside him, with Carlos documenting his recovery, with a community of supporters who'd been moved by his story. Isabella herself became an unexpected advocate, speaking at conferences about children's rights, institutional abuse, and the dangers of allowing wealth to circumvent justice. She never returned to domestic work. Instead, she found her calling in helping others navigate the legal system when power tried to silence truth. Months after the story broke, Isabella and Thomas stood together outside St. Catherine's Orphanage. Sister Margaret waited at the entrance, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You came back," she whispered, when Thomas approached. "After all these years, both of you came back. We came to show you that he's okay," Isabella said, "that your prayers were answered, that someone did help him eventually." Thomas hugged the elderly nun who'd carried guilt for 15 years. "Thank you for keeping my letter," he said, "for remembering me, for carrying that burden all this time. I'm so sorry I didn't do more," Sister Margaret sobbed. "I'm so sorry I was afraid." "You did what you could," Thomas said, with a forgiveness that showed his healing was genuine. "And now, we're all here, on the other side of it. That has to mean something." They planted a tree that day in the orphanage courtyard. A memorial not to tragedy, but to survival. A reminder that sometimes the children who grow up invisible become the adults who change everything. That sometimes the truth takes 15 years to emerge, but it emerges nonetheless. That sometimes the powerful lose, and the powerless win, and justice prevails against all odds. As the sun set over the city, Isabella and Thomas sat on the orphanage steps where they'd once sat as children. So much had changed. So much had been lost, and found, and transformed. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for remembering me, for coming for me, for refusing to let me stay erased." "You would have done the same for me," Isabella replied. "I don't know if I would have been that brave." "You were brave every day for 14 years, Isabella said. "You survived. You kept some part of yourself alive despite everything they did to break you. That's the bravest thing anyone can do." They sat in companionable silence. Two survivors of systems that had tried to make them invisible, now living proof that visibility could be reclaimed, that voices could be restored, that truth could overcome even the most powerful lies. Somewhere in the city, in a mansion that now felt empty despite its grandeur, the Worthington legacy crumbled. But here, on these steps, a different legacy was being built, one of courage, perseverance, and the unbreakable human spirit. Thomas Patterson had been found. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. And Isabella Martinez, the maid who dared to ask questions, had found her purpose in the process. Sometimes the smallest voices change everything. Sometimes the most powerless people move mountains. Sometimes justice takes 15 years, but it arrives nonetheless. And sometimes, just sometimes, the boy in the portrait steps out of the frame and reclaims his life.